You've heard them in true crime documentaries, in crime dramas. You've often heard statements about what criminals always do. But what if I told you that many of those ideas are completely wrong? I'm Dr. Kelly, I'm a forensic psychologist, and today I want to debunk 3 of what I think are probably the biggest myths about criminal behaviour. So let's start off with the one that continues to be present, is that most criminals are psychopaths, especially violent ones. No. So psychopathy is overrepresented in prison populations compared to the general public, but it's still such a small minority. And even it could be as low as 1-2% or even up to 25% of people that are in prison would meet the criteria for psychopathy. I've done another video about psychopathy because it isn't a diagnosis, again maybe contrary to what people think. But most crimes, or most people who commit crimes, aren't evil or remorseless. They're often affected by a number of factors. So it could be trauma, it could be their environment that they grew up in, it could be about substance misuse, it can be more about personality driven factors, so about impulsivity. It could be about socioeconomic pressure and sometimes even mental health, but it's not always. But psychopathy is something that always makes the headlines. But it's not the whole story. That when we look at the motives for engaging in criminal behaviour, it's not as simple as saying that someone's a psychopath. It is a lot more complex than that. And the myth number 2 is that people that commit crime don't feel guilt. And this is another common belief that if someone breaks the law, then they must be lacking a conscience. But remorse and regret are super common, particularly with individuals who have committed a crime for the first time, or younger individuals, or those who have maybe committed crimes impulsively. And psychologists and therapists who work in forensic settings will often explore guilt and remorse as a way into rehabilitation. And guilt and remorse can be quite a therapeutic asset if it's acknowledged, if it's explored, and if it's worked with. However, the absence of guilt doesn't define criminality, but sometimes that unresolved guilt will often tell a bigger story than what's going on. So it's about really understanding that it's not something that people don't have a conscience because they commit crimes. It's about really being able to understand that and see if it can be used as a facilitator for rehabilitation. Myth number 3 is that people who do have mental health difficulties are more dangerous. And this one really matters. But I think particularly in the current climate, what you see on TV, what you see in the media, and particularly the stigma around mental health, that is still there. But research consistently shows that people who do have mental health difficulties are far more likely to be victims of crimes, and particularly violent crimes, than perpetrators. So in fact, that with mental health, it can be a factor in crime, but it's often in combination with a lot of other risk variables. So again, it could be about substance misuse, it could be lack of support, whether that is through social support or services, and often looking at untreated trauma. So when people say that mental health difficulties equals dangerousness, that we ignore the systems, we ignore the structures and the context that actually creates the risk. And the stories, just I suppose to conclude, that the stories that we tell about criminal behaviour really shapes everything from the sentencing to the stigma to policy to public opinion. And as a forensic psychologist, I believe that we need to be honest, we need to be curious, we need to use evidence and factually based to really understand crime, and not just to be dramatic because it makes a good TV show. If you found this myth busting helpful, then please let me know. Please hit like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments maybe what crime related myth you might have heard that just doesn't sit right. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Take care.